Is there a boundary? A final line where our ability to dream, to invent, to create simply runs out? Or is imagination infinite, an endless sky that expands the further we look? This question is not just philosophical, it's practical. Every time a scientist envisions a new theory, or an artist paints a scene from their inner world, or even when a child dreams of flying, they are brushing against the limits of imagination. And in many ways, the progress of humanity, our science, our art, even our societies depends on where or if those limits exist. So today, let's journey into this mystery. Where does imagination end? What do science and art tell us? And what does it mean for us, living, thinking, dreaming beings? Before we can ask where imagination ends, we need to ask, what is imagination? Psychologists often define it as the ability to form mental images or concepts of things not present to the senses. It's what allows us to picture a purple elephant dancing on the ceiling or to simulate the possible outcomes of a decision we're about to make. Philosophers from Aristotle to Kant saw imagination as the bridge between perception and reason. It's not mere fantasy, it's the capacity to manipulate reality in our minds, and sometimes improve upon it. Neuroscience adds another layer. Imagination arises from networks like the default mode, network DMN in the brain. This network lights up when we're daydreaming, storytelling, or reflecting. It's the part of the brain that stitches fragments of memory and perception into new possibilities. So imagination is both whimsical and practical, both science and story. But even knowing this, where does it end? Let's start with science. Take the example of the atom in the universe. For centuries, humans believed the atom was indivisible, the smallest particle of existence. That was the end of imagination, or so it seemed. But in the early 20th century, scientists like Niels Bohr and Ernest Rutherford imagined what lay inside the atom. Their vision of subatomic particles not only expanded science, but reshaped our world through nuclear power, medicine, and quantum physics. And at the opposite scale, the universe itself, astronomers once imagined the cosmos as a fixed, eternal expanse. Then Einstein dared to imagine space as elastic, capable of bending and expanding. Today, we're still stretching imagination to understand what might lie beyond. Parallel universes, extra dimensions, dark matter. Each time we think we've reached the edge, imagination pushes further. The first example is that of flight. For millennia, humans dreamed of flight. Ancient myths gave us Icarus, who strapped on wax wings. Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines centuries before aviation was possible. Yet for many, the dream of flight seemed to end there, a fantasy, a poetic metaphor. Then came the Wright brothers, who transformed imagination into reality. But did imagination stop with the airplane? Not at all. It grew wings of its own: rockets, space travel, the International Space Station. Even now, scientists imagine interstellar travel and warp drives, concepts that blur science fiction and science fact. Imagination doesn't seem to end. It evolves. Now let's take artificial intelligence. Yes, even the technology writing these words. Decades ago, Alan Turing imagined a machine that could think. Most dismissed it as impossible. Computers were giant, clunky machines used for calculations, not for simulating human thought. But imagination didn't stop there. Today, artificial intelligence writes poetry, paints, and diagnoses diseases. But here's the paradox. AI itself is the product of imagination, yet it also extends our imaginations. When we see an AI compose music or design art, it makes us wonder, are there limits to what machines can imagine? Or do they inherit our own boundaries? If science stretches imagination through discovery, art stretches it through expression. And here too we can ask, does it ever truly end? Let's take the example of poet William Blake. The English poet and painter William Blake lived in the 18th century, but seemed centuries ahead. He painted angels in trees, saw visions of divine beings, and created entire mythologies in his poems. To many, he appeared mad, but his art was the proof that imagination doesn't stop at what is visible. It dares to paint the invisible. For Blake, imagination was not confined to what the eye could see. It was an infinite realm, even if others couldn't follow him there. Or consider Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali's surrealist works, melting clocks, dreamlike landscapes, pushed art into the unconscious. His paintings asked, if dreams are limitless, shouldn't art be too? Dali once said, I don't do drugs. I am drugs. His imagination didn't merely end at the canvas, it spilled into his persona, his life, his mustache. He blurred the line between art and existence itself, or even Beethoven's imagination. Imagination doesn't end even with silence. Ludwig van Beethoven composed some of his most profound works while deaf. He could no longer hear notes in the air, but he heard symphonies in his mind. This raises an astonishing truth. Imagination does not depend on external input. It can thrive in isolation, perhaps even more vividly. When Beethoven composed his Ninth Symphony, filled with triumph and joy, he could not hear a single note, yet his imagination carried him beyond silence. So does imagination truly have no end? Science offers one answer. Imagination is bounded by the brain. Our neurons, our cognitive architecture, set parameters. For instance, most people struggle to imagine a completely new color, something outside the visible spectrum. Our eyes and brains simply cannot conceive it. Likewise, many paradoxes strain imagination. Can you picture a four-dimensional cube? We can describe it mathematically, but our minds bend and break trying to see it. So in one sense, imagination does have boundaries shaped by biology, perception, and the structure of reality itself. But here's the twist. Even when imagination fails, it sparks creativity. Artists have tried to depict impossible objects. Think of M.C. Escher's staircases that loop forever. Scientists use abstract math to imagine dimensions we cannot see. Our very failure to picture the impossible becomes fuel for greater acts of imagination. Perhaps imagination ends only where curiosity ends. The more we ask questions, the further imagination stretches. The moment we stop wondering, we draw the line ourselves. Albert Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, and all there ever will be to know and understand. And here's the paradox. Imagination may have limits, but those limits keep expanding. Think of the horizon at sea. From where you stand, it looks like the end. But sail forward and the horizon moves. The end of imagination is not a wall. It's a horizon that recedes as we advance. This isn't just about great scientists and artists. Imagination matters to us every day. When a child pretends the couch is a pirate ship, that's imagination. When you picture yourself in a new career, or imagine a life in another city, or even rehearse what you'll say in a difficult conversation, that's imagination at work. Sometimes imagination can be painful. It can invent fears, anxieties, worst-case scenarios. But even here, imagination reminds us of its power. It can make the unreal feel real, which means we can choose to use it differently, to imagine hope, possibility, beauty. So the question, where does imagination end, isn't abstract. It's personal. The boundaries of your imagination often determine the boundaries of your life. So, where does imagination end? In science, every limit we've reached has given way to new discoveries. In art, imagination expands into dreams, visions, even silence. In our own lives, imagination can both imprison us in fear and liberate us into possibility. Perhaps imagination ends only when we stop daring to use it, when we stop asking questions, when we stop creating. But as long as humanity dreams, as long as a child sketches stars or a scientist dares to question reality, imagination never ends. It stretches outward, like the universe itself, boundless, mysterious, infinite. So maybe the better question is not, where does imagination end? But rather, how far are we willing to take it? Thank you.